So in the first part of this lab, I got to experiment with some different vegetables and see how different pH levels affected these. So in the first picture, I've got some broccoli and carrots. The broccoli was my chlorophyll group and the carrots were my carotenoid group. And looking at the control broccoli, as you can see, it held its color well. It stayed, the same bright green that it looked before. It was boiled. And then the piece of broccoli that was cooked in vinegar, which was my acid, turned an olive green. And the broccoli that was boiled in baking soda, which was the alkali group, held its bright green color pretty well too, but it did look a bit shrunken compared to the other two, and it just generally looked more mushy. And then one thing to note about the piece that was cooked in vinegar is, as we can see, this is a great example of how chlorophyll interacts with heat and acids differently than most vegetables. And this is because when chlorophyll interacts with heat and acids, what ends up happening is the magnesium ions in the chlorophyll are replaced with hydrogen ions, which is what causes chlorophyll to turn into pheophytin, which is what causes that olive green color. So next, we have the carrots. As you can see, the control group held its color very well, and the acid group did have a very bright color. It looks significantly brighter, I think. And then the the alkali group has like a whole green covering over it, which is so gross in my opinion. It looks like mold. But this is just because the way the baking soda interacts with the pigment, it just basically like breaks down the color and causes it to turn like that, which is pretty gross. So moving on to our cauliflower and red cabbage, the cauliflower being our anthocyanin group and the red cabbage being the anthocyanin group, as you can see. So looking at the control for the cauliflower, it did hold its cream color pretty well, and the tenderness was, it wasn't too mushy. Like, it had a pretty good texture after just being boiled. And then looking at the acid, this is a great example, again, of just how it really brightens that color, which ended up turning it, a bright white color, compared to when we look at the alkali group. It's even more of like an egg yellow cream-ish color with these yellow spots on it. And I think the yellow spots are really just from the way that the baking soda again interacts with the pigment of the cauliflower. It was just very interesting to see how that affected that. And then the red cabbage I personally think was the most interesting. As you can see, the control group held its color well. It stayed that deep, dark red, not red, but purple. And then the acid did kind of turn like a reddish purple color. And then the alkali, obviously, as you can see, turned green, which I thought was really interesting to see. And it also had these like white spots on it, which it's hard to tell in the photo, but it like looked kind of powdery on the outside. So that was just interesting because I guess it just didn't really like absorb the baking soda. So yeah, that was very interesting. So moving on to part 2 of this experiment, I got to see how different potatoes looked and tasted after being boiled, and then the other half of these potatoes being mashed. So the first potato I have here is the Yukon golden potato, also known as an all-purpose potato. These potatoes I noticed after being boiled were a bit crumbly when I applied pressure, and I noticed the skin was just very tender, very soft. I think they did taste, pretty typical to a normal baked potato, other than the very soft skin, just in my personal opinion. But when I mashed the second half of these were the easiest to mash, with just a little bit of warm milk and butter added. And these potatoes, easily became very creamy and fluffy, and just very smooth. And I personally thought that the taste of these was the best overall, out of all three. And the reason these potatoes mash so well is because their starch and moisture content is the. So the second potato I did was the red potatoes, which are also known as waxy potatoes. These red potatoes I thought held their color pretty well, other than they just looked a little bit duller than before I had boiled them. I noticed too that these potatoes were firmer than the Yukon Golden potatoes were after being boiled, and I think just the overall tenderness and flavor of these would be more ideal for something like a potato salad, whereas the Yukon Golden potatoes I noticed are, a better choice for something like mashing. But when I did mash the second half of these red potatoes, it didn't take too much warm milk and butter to get it to a pretty good creamy consistency. But it wasn't quite the same as the Yukon potatoes were. And obviously, there's not that golden hue to the mashed potatoes either, like we saw with the first photo. So the reason that these didn't mash the same way that Yukon potatoes did is because these are higher in moisture content than the other two, and they're lower in starch content. So this makes these best for boiling because they become perfectly tender but not too mushy. So lastly, I boiled some russet potatoes, which are also known as non-waxy potatoes. These potatoes became crumbly like the Yukon potatoes when I applied a little bit of pressure. However, this was the only potato I noticed that didn't look any duller after boiling it. In my opinion, I did not particularly like the taste and like just the tenderness of these for being boiled. And then when I mashed the second half of these potatoes, I noticed that I kept on having to add more milk. And I think it ended up being probably like double the amount of warm milk that I had to use for the other two just to get it to like a little bit of a creamy texture. But this is because these potatoes are very high in their starch content and very low in their moisture content. So it just really makes it hard to get it to that creamy, smooth, fluffy consistency that most people look for in mashed potatoes. I would say these are definitely, more ideal for something like frying or baking, which can help like just get that crisp outside with a nice tender, inside. But yeah, I didn't really like particularly enjoy these that much boiled or mashed. I think the Yukon Gold was a little bit better tasting mashed, just because the texture was a lot better. And then the red potatoes, I think, in my opinion, were probably the best boiled. So, yeah.